In the social media age we currently live in, we know everything about all of our favorite athletes all the time. In this sense, despite being a famous Hall of Fame NFL quarterback, Brett Favre remains somewhat a relic of the past. For decades, long before Twitter and Instagram and Snapchat, he began to successfully craft and cultivate an image of a good old boy who you'd love to have a beer with. A normal guy who just so happened to get lucky with a golden arm and make it as an NFL superstar. He wasn't one of those spoiled athletic marvels that you couldn't really relate to. He was fun, he was great at what he did, great enough for you to ignore those pesky interceptions and turnovers at least, and most importantly, he enjoyed doing what he did, so you enjoyed watching him. He was supposedly everything good about what sports can be, at least on the surface. As the years went on, and as his career entered its final stages and beyond, well into retirement, Favre's actions, including some that could be described as legitimately evil, have bubbled to the surface. For all of the "he's just a fun-loving kid out there" narratives we were fed about him for decades, it turned out he was actually a massive prima donna who demanded special treatment, an unfaithful husband, and the bar scenes of Atlanta and Green Bay in the 90s and 2000s have plenty of stories too. So much so that the nickname Buckhead Brett reigns on his Pro Football Reference page. Now, almost 15 years after he last played an NFL game, Favre is facing the most serious allegations of all: welfare fraud. I don't want to get sued, so I'm not going to outright say he is guilty, but I mean, let's be real here, guys. Anyway, this video is about Favre's 20-year NFL career, not his off-field missteps, but I felt that before I dove into his on-field career that I had to address the massive elephant in the room about Favre right now. And now that that's out of the way, enjoy a deep dive into one of the best quarterbacks of all time who is a little bit too liberal about sending dong pics. Before I begin, I want to take a moment to shout out the sponsor of today's video, DraftKings. Basketball fans, playoff time is near, and I've teamed up with DraftKings, an official partner of the NBA, to help fuel the action. Say hello to their newest way to play fantasy sports, Pick6. Right now, new customers can get up $200 back in Pick6 credits if your first pick set loses. It's really simple to get started. All you got to do is just download the DraftKings Pick6 app and sign up with code BARRY. Then you pick at least 2 players and choose if they'll have more or less of a stat, such as if they will score more or less than 30 points, or whether they'll have more or less than 8 assists, more or less than 10 rebounds, whatever you want. Lock them in and compete against others for a shot at huge cash prizes. So download the DraftKings Pick6 app now and sign up with code BARRY. Once again, all you got to do, download the DraftKings Pick6 app right now and sign up with code BARRY only on DraftKings Pick6. The crown is yours. Let's go. After a relatively successful college career as a 4-year starter at Southern Mississippi, which was most known for him getting in a car accident that nearly killed him, his stats are not overwhelming or indicative of a guy who would throw for 500 plus touchdowns in the NFL, let me just say that. Favre was drafted by the Atlanta Falcons in the second round of the 91 draft, thanks largely due to his freakish arm strength. At the time, Atlanta had suffered double-digit losing seasons in 6 of the previous 7 years. But in Favre's rookie season, they would shock the world by going 10-6 and winning a playoff game over their rivals Saints. But Atlanta head coach Jerry Glanville hated Favre, and he had nothing to do with Atlanta's sudden burst of success. Favre appeared in just 2 games, throwing 4 passes, 2 of which were returned for touchdowns, while also taking a sack. His final career passer rating for the Falcons is literally 0.0, and his adjusted net yards per attempt is a hilarious negative 20.20. With fellow young quarterback Chris Miller emerging as a Pro Bowler and Favre self-destructing off the field, Favre became easily expendable. There was one team, and more like one man, that still believed in Favre's abilities, however. That man's name was Ron Wolf, the new GM of the Green Bay Packers. Wolf believed so much in Favre that he sent Atlanta a first-round pick for the unproven troublemaker. Everybody at the time was laughing at the Packers, and although nobody knew it yet, the trio of Brett Favre, Mike Holmgren, and Ron Wolf, all joining Green Bay at the same time in '92, would jumpstart a dormant franchise desperate for success for the first time since the late 60s. 1992. Despite the hype to get Favre, he remained in Green Bay where he was in Atlanta, on the bench, behind a quarterback who made a Pro Bowl before, Don Majkowski, aka the Magic Man. But outside of 1989, when Majkowski led Green Bay to a surprising 10-6 record with a bunch of comebacks, he hadn't done much and couldn't stay healthy. He started the first 2 games of the season for the Packers, which were both losses. Favre got into the second game against Tampa, which was a blowout loss, completing the first pass of his career to himself, but it wouldn't be until the third game of the season against Cincy that the Favre era officially got ushered in. Mikowski got hurt, shocker, and also Wally pipped, although nobody would know it at the time. Favre had a very up and down day, but would make up for it with a game-winning touchdown pass in the final minute to lead Green Bay to a stunning 24-23 victory. Following an incredible performance versus Pittsburgh, Favre and company hit a rough patch with losses to Atlanta and Cleveland, where they couldn't tie the game in the fourth quarter with the ball, and a blowout home loss to the Bears in Mike Ditka's final season as coach there. Following a loss to the Giants, where Favre had a terrible fourth quarter where he threw 2 interceptions on the same drive. Yes, you heard that correctly. He threw a pick down 13-7, then forced the defender to fumble it back to Green Bay just to throw a pick 6 a few plays later as the Packers fell to 3-6. But then Favre would go on a heater, ripping off 6 straight wins to get Green Bay on the cusp of their first playoff appearance since 1982 at 9-6. All they had to do was defeat Minnesota and they'd clinch a wild card spot, but it was not to be, as Green Bay took an early 7-0 lead, but 3 Favre interceptions helped lead to a 27-7 blowout loss to finish the season at 9-7. Despite missing the playoffs, hoping Green Bay hadn't been higher in 25 years. Favre was one of the feel-good stories of the league, and everybody was convinced Green Bay would be title contenders in 93. But there's a reason they play the games on the field and not on paper. 1993. 93 would end up being a disappointment for Favre individually, even though he made the Pro Bowl somehow, and, more importantly, the Packers finally returned to the playoffs thanks largely to the addition of Reggie White in free agency. Favre individually regressed to 19 touchdowns and 24 interceptions, leading the league in the latter category. He also led the league in fourth quarter comebacks, but this was misleading and largely due to opportunity and not efficiency. In fact, the Packers' disappointing 9-7 record can largely fall on Favre's repeated failures in the fourth quarter when tied or within 1 score. In week 2 versus Philly with the score tied at 17, Favre got the ball but had to punt, and Philly eventually won 20-17. In week 4 versus Minnesota, Favre led a go-ahead field goal drive early in the fourth quarter, but did nothing with 3 drives up 1 point before Minnesota kicked a game-winning field goal as time expired to win 15-13. A blowout loss to Dallas, a recurring theme in Favre's career, dropped Green Bay to 1-3 before they hit their stride, winning 6 of their next 7 to get to 7-4, but they easily could have won 7 in a row if not for a close loss to KC in week 10. But a fumble down 4 and a game-losing interception by Favre down 7 sealed the 23-16 defeat. Favre would throw for 400 yards versus the Bears in week 14, but he wasted 3 fourth quarter possessions with a chance to win. The first was a punt down 3, then a turnover on downs down 6, and then he finally threw a game-losing pick 6 down 6 to seal the 30-17 loss. 2 weeks later versus the rival Vikings, the 8-5 Packers had 2 fourth quarter drives down 4 with a chance to win at home, but the first ended on downs and the other ended with a, you guessed it, Favre interception to seal the 21-17 loss. A blowout win over the Raiders left Green Bay 9-6 heading into their week 18 finale on the road versus Detroit, and Favre would throw 4 interceptions, including one down 23-20 in the fourth in a disappointing 30-20 loss. But Green Bay would get its revenge the very next week in the same venue for its first playoff win in a non-strike season since 1967. In his playoff debut, Favre was mostly magnificent, throwing 3 touchdowns, all to Sterling Sharp, although he did have a pick 6 in the third that dropped Green Bay to a 17-7 deficit. That pick 6 was canceled out by a 101-yard pick 6 by Green Bay's George Teague, giving Green Bay a 21-17 lead entering the fourth. A non-Barry Sanders running back for Detroit scored to make it 24-21. The teams exchanged punts, and then Favre famously found Sharp on a 40-yard bomb to put Green Bay up 4 with under a minute left, and they hung on to win. It would be just one of 2 playoff fourth quarter comeback and game-winning drives that Favre had in his 24 career playoff starts. All of Green Bay's momentum would die the next week in Texas Stadium versus the dynastic Dallas Cowboys. Green Bay took a 3-0 lead, but 3 touchdown passes by Troy Aikman gave Dallas a commanding 24-3 lead late in the third before Favre answered with a touchdown pass. Green Bay's last hope came with the ball down 14 in the fourth, but Favre threw an interception. Dallas kicked a field goal before another Favre interception, and then a garbage time Favre touchdown pass rounded out the scoring on the Packers' 27-17 defeat. Well, at least the next season wouldn't end the same way, right? Right? 1994. In many ways, 1994 would be the most pivotal year in both Favre and Mike Holmgren's careers. Despite a playoff win and Pro Bowl appearance the year before, Favre's inconsistency and struggles from 93 continued into the early part of the 94 season. Standing 1-1 going into week 3 versus the Eagles, Favre did nothing with 3 fourth quarter opportunities down 6, and the Packers lost 13-7 to drop them to 1-2. 2 weeks later, at 2-2, Green Bay traveled to New England, where Favre had 4 tries in the fourth quarter, down 4 to do something. After 2 interceptions and a punt, he finally came through on try number 4, leading Green Bay to a go-ahead touchdown drive. The extra point was flubbed, giving Green Bay only a 2-point lead. Drew Bledsoe, who was tied for the most playoff touchdown passes, 1, on the Super Bowl champion 2001 Patriots, promptly marched New New England downfield for the game-winning field goal to send Green Bay to another loss. Perhaps the most forgotten and overlooked important game of Favre's career came 3 weeks later versus Minnesota, when Favre got benched for Mark Brunell in a 13-10 loss to the Vikings. Afterwards, Holmgren was tasked with the monumental decision to either stick with Favre or go with Brunell, and he stuck with Favre, and the rest is history. Green Bay ripped off 3 straight wins to get to 6-4, although they would then lose 3 straight to drop to 6-7. In those 3 losses, though, Favre tossed 10 touchdowns and had a 100.2 passer rating, but his crunch time struggles still popped up. Versus Buffalo, he had 3 tries down 7 in the 4th. The first 2 ended with punts, and the last ended in a safety in a 29-20 loss. The next week, versus a Jason Garrett-led Dallas Cowboys on Thanksgiving, Favre played a great game, but his 2 drives down 8 in the 4th quarter ended in a punt and a turnover on downs in a 42-31 loss. Favre threw for 366 yards and 3 more touchdowns the next week versus Detroit, but on 2 drives down 3 in the 4th, he threw an interception and turned it over on downs to lose 34-31. If Green Bay wanted to make the playoffs, they had to win out, and that's exactly what they did, with Favre playing magnificent to finish 9-7 once again and securing a wildcard berth and the divisional title. Favre finished the season with 33 touchdown passes, 23 of which came in the final 8 games. A remarkable number for any era, but especially in 94. Just like in 93, the Pack would face their rival Lions in the playoff opener, although this time it would be at Lambeau. Unlike 93, the Packers would be without Sterling Sharp, who had to retire after the 94 regular season due to neck problems. In a game most famous for Barry Sanders running for negative yards, Green Bay held on to win 16-12 thanks to their defense coming through strong late in the 4th to stave off multiple game-winning drive attempts by Detroit. Green Bay's reward for beating Detroit in the wildcard round for the 2nd straight year was, well, a trip to Texas Stadium to face the dynastic Cowboys for the 2nd straight year. The hope was that with a much improved version of Favre, the Pack could compete. The reality was that even with an improved Favre and an injury early on to Hall of Fame running back Emmitt Smith, Green Bay got the shit kicked out of them 35-9 in a game that was never close. It's probably the most forgettable and boring playoff loss of Favre's career, a blowout where he didn't throw an abnormal amount of interceptions. Boo! Not entertaining. It was obvious that Dallas was going to be the roadblock Green Bay had to learn to defeat if they ever wanted to do anything, but it was also apparent Green Bay now had an elite quarterback who was just about to enter his peak. 1995. 95 would be the year Favre became the best player in the NFL, but that didn't mean it didn't have its warts. Favre and Green Bay lost to the lowly Rams at home on opening day with Favre throwing 3 interceptions, the last of which came down 7 in the 4th in a 17-14 loss. Then Green Bay hit the burners and Favre resumed his MVP play from the second half of 94, leading Green Bay to a 5-2 record with 16 touchdown passes to that point on the year, but then came a few more stumbles. Versus Detroit in Week 9, Favre threw 3 interceptions and fumbled the game away inside Detroit's 3-yard line down by 8 in the 4th. The next week versus Minnesota, and this is something, both Favre and his backup, Ty Detmer, got hurt, and the game was tied 24-24 with under a minute left. Green Bay had the ball on the Vikings' 38-yard line on the verge of field goal range when on 3rd and 1, Mike Holmgren called for 3rd-string quarterback TJ Rubley to do a quarterback sneak. However, Rubley audibled and called a rollout. He passed the ball and it was intercepted, giving Minnesota the ball and eventually the win. In a surprise to nobody, Rubley was cut later that week. This needs to be way more well known. It's fucking hilarious. If you want to pinpoint the exact moment Brett Favre became an NFL legend, I would say that Week 11 versus Chicago in 95 is the place to look. Favre would throw 5 touchdowns on that day, and over the last 7 games in the 95 season, he had a preposterous 21 touchdowns to 2 interceptions with a blistering 123 passer rating. Green Bay would go 6-1 in that stretch, and its only loss being to Tampa, a game where Favre led a go-ahead touchdown drive in the 4th, and Green Bay missed a game-winning field goal at the end of regulation. Green Bay won their division again and finished 11-5, but they failed to get a first-round bye thanks in large part to their disappointing losses to the Rams and Bucks. Nevertheless, Favre was named league MVP after throwing for 39 touchdowns and a 99.5 rating, while also leading the league in adjusted net yards per attempt. He was clearly the best player in the world and deservedly got the award. Green Bay opened up at home in the wildcard round versus the potent Jeff George-led Falcons, Favre's original team, in case you forgot. Well, Favre didn't, as he threw for 3 touchdowns and a relatively stress-free 37-20 win. Green Bay's reward was a trip not to Dallas, but to the other NFC powerhouse that had ruled the 90s, San Francisco. For 3 straight years, San Francisco and Dallas had met in the NFC Championship game and were expected to do so again in 95, as San Fran entered the game as 9.5-point favorites. When Green Bay missed an opening drive field goal, there was a here we go again type of feeling, but then Green Bay returned a fumble for a touchdown to go up 7-0 and rode that momentum the rest of the way. Favre had one of the best games of his career, completing 75% of his passes for 299 yards and a 132.9 passer rating. Green Bay took a commanding 21-0 lead early after back-to-back Favre touchdown passes and held on to win a pretty decisive 27-17 upset over the defending champs. But then, finally, Green Bay ran into the boogeyman. For the third straight year, they had to travel to Texas Stadium to face the Cowboys, who were looking for their third ring in 4 years to cement a dynasty. Favre began the game 0 for 6 with an interception, which led to Dallas jumping out to a 14-3 lead. It looked like another blowout before Favre and Green Bay grabbed their nuts and responded big time. Favre's next 2 passes were both touchdowns, which put Green Bay up 17-14. Dallas would have a 24-17 halftime lead before Green Bay rallied again, ripping off 10 straight points, capped off by Favre's third touchdown pass of the day to give Green Bay a 27-24 lead with 5 minutes left in the third as 9-point underdog. But Dallas responded as all great teams do, with a long touchdown drive to go back up by 4 early in the fourth. Green Bay's window to shock the world for a second straight week ended when Favre then threw a bad interception to Larry Brown, and Troy Aikman quickly found famous teammate and haircut respecter Michael Irvin for a touchdown to go up by 11. Favre and Green Bay would get 2 more drives down 38-27, but both ended on downs as they fell to Dallas for the third straight season. 1996. In 1996, after winning 3 rings in 4 seasons, the Dallas Cowboys fell off from dominant to just good, leaving the Super Bowl window wide open for Green Bay. Paired with Favre at his absolute peak, a good running game, a deep receiving core, and head coach Mike Holmgren doing his thing calling plays, Green Bay finished first in points per game. Don't forget about the defense though. The Reggie White and Leroy Butler-led unit finished first in points allowed per game, making the 96 Packers the only team to ever lead in both in the same season. As if that wasn't enough, Green Bay had the best return unit in the league thanks to Desmond Howard. The 96 Packers won games by an average of 15.4 points per game. If anything, you could argue they underachieved by finishing 13-3 instead of 14-2 or 15-1, but nevertheless, they secured home field advantage throughout the playoffs. The only thing that scared Green Bay was the thought of a 4th straight playoff matchup with Dallas, who they again lost to in the regular season. But Green Bay's path to Super Bowl glory was made easier as they got to face Elvis Grbac in the divisional round instead of Steve Young, which ended in an easy 35-14 win. Then they got to face a second-year franchise in Carolina instead of Dallas in the NFC Championship game, which, despite an early scare, ended with another easy 30-13 win. Finally, they got to face a very good but not great Patriots team instead of the 13-3 Broncos in Super Bowl 31. Favre once again won MVP, throwing for 38 touchdowns, but his role in the playoffs was surprisingly mundane. He averaged 34 pass attempts per game in the regular season, but just 24 attempts in the 3 playoff games. Is it a coincidence that the only time Favre ever won a Super Bowl came in the same postseason where he had by far his fewest pass attempts per game? I don't know. Anyway, in Super Bowl 31, Green Bay fell behind 14-10 after the first quarter, but following an 81-yard touchdown pass from Favre to Antonio Freeman, they never trailed again. Favre threw 2 touchdowns and ran for a third, but was surprisingly not named Super Bowl MVP, as that honor went to Desmond Howard, who had a 99-yard kickoff return touchdown in the third, put Green Bay up 35-21, which was also the final score. With a Super Bowl win now on his resume, in addition to his raw numbers and 2 MVPs, Favre was now already a future Hall of Famer at just the age of 27. The only thing missing from his resume was a Super Bowl MVP, which he easily could have won for Super Bowl 31, but almost everybody felt that it was inevitable he would get there because he was going to be in so many more Super Bowls with a burgeoning Green Bay dynasty. But there's a reason why they say not to assume things. 1997. The 97 Packers weren't as dominant as the 96 version, but they finished with the same 13-3 record. By this point, the Cowboys were out of the picture entirely, but San Francisco was not, as it was the 49ers, not the Packers, who secured the 1 seed in the NFC thanks to fewer losses to conference opponents. A missed field goal and a Week 2 loss to Philadelphia determined that. Anyway, Favre continued his greatness, winning his 3rd straight MVP, although this time he had to share with Barry Sanders. Sharing is caring, kids. With a first-round bye, the Pack hosted division rival Tampa in the divisional round. It was a sloppy game where both quarterbacks didn't play well, but Favre was slightly less terrible than his counterpart Trent Dilfer, who somehow finished with as many Super Bowl rings and Super Bowl MVPs as Favre. That just blows my fucking mind. Green Bay won 21-7 to reach their 3rd straight conference championship game, this time against the Niners, who would be without Jerry Rice. Despite being on the road, the Packers were favored to win, and it was a wise prediction, as Favre continued to torture the 49ers in the playoffs, averaging over 8 yards per attempt and a 98.1 rating in the win, badly outplaying Steve Young. Paired with the dominant ground game with Dorsey Levens, who ran for 114 yards, the Packers won relatively easily 23-10 to reach their 2nd straight Super Bowl. All of the Packers' dynasty predictions appeared to be coming true, and their opponent this time would be Denver, who were seen as old and inferior to the younger Pack. It also didn't help that the NFC had won 13 straight Super Bowls at this point, and Denver's quarterback John Elway was 0-3 in them, being blown out badly each time. Favre was going to win his 2nd ring and his first Super Bowl MVP to pair with his 3 MVPs. It was inevitable. The Packers were 11-point favorites, and on the opening drive of Super Bowl 32, marched right down the field to go up 7-0 on a gorgeous Favre touchdown pass to Antonio Freeman. The thing that nobody accounted for, though, was Terrell Davis ripping Green Bay's defense a new asshole. Although they should have, considering run defense was easily Green Bay's biggest weakness as a team. The All-Pro and NFL touchdown leader would end up running for 157 yards and 3 touchdowns, despite dealing with migraines and losing a fumble. After taking that 7-0 lead early, Denver ripped off 17 points in a row thanks to 2 Favre turnovers, a fumble and an interception. Favre would collect himself and throw his second impressive touchdown pass of the game just before halftime to make it 17-14. Green Bay then kicked a field goal to make it 17-17 early in the third before Denver went back up 24-17 on a Davis touchdown. When Antonio Freeman fumbled the ensuing kickoff deep in Packers territory, it looked dire for the Pack, but Elway threw a terrible interception to famous wedding vow respecter Eugene Robinson to keep Green Bay alive. And with this chance, Favre took advantage of it like it was a poor person from Mississippi, throwing a game-tying touchdown early in the fourth to Freeman to make it 24-24. Shout out to Jack Bauer. Favre would then get 2 drives in the fourth quarter with the game tied and a chance to give Green Bay the lead, which leads me to this. If there was any area where Favre fell short statistically during his MVP three-peat, and there weren't many, it was in fourth quarter comebacks and game-winning drives. He had just 1 fourth quarter comeback and 2 game-winning drives over those 3 years combined. He was an incredible front-runner, and Green Bay won a lot of games big, but he still had troubles when trailing or tied late in close games. It showed up in the 95 NFC Championship game versus Dallas. He avoided a clutch situation like this in 96, which is when the Packers waltzed to a Super Bowl championship, but when faced with another clutch situation like this in 97, like he did in 95, he once again stumbled, and you could argue this is the reason why Green Bay didn't win 3 rings in a row. Both Green Bay's drives with the ball tied at 24 ended in punts. Denver then marched down the field, punching it in on Davis's 3rd touchdown run of the day, thanks to Green Bay playing give-up defense to go up 31-24 with 1:47 left. Favre would have more than enough time to tie the game again, and he quickly moved Green Bay into Denver territory, but the drive stalled out for good at the Denver 31 on downs, sealing Green Bay's defeat and marking the last time Favre would ever play in a Super Bowl in his legendary career. As time has gone on, the only solace that Green Bay and Favre fans can take in this loss is that it wasn't really an upset, or as big of an upset as everybody thought at the time. Denver from 96 to 98 went 46-12, 79.3% winning percentage, and won 2 Super Bowls, although they got caught cheating the salary cap, but nobody cares about that. For those 3 years, Denver was a dominant team and probably should have made the Super Bowl 3 years in a row if not for an upstart Jacksonville Jaguars team in 96. However, the chances were right there for Favre to get ring number 2, and had he thrown a 4th touchdown to win the game, or Green Bay just won 31-24 or 27-24 in general, there's no doubt he would have gotten that elusive Super Bowl MVP. Because it happened earlier in his career, this loss might not be as well remembered as some of his other playoff failures, but I would argue that no playoff loss was a bigger hit to Favre's legacy. 1998. Despite reports that Mike Holmgren was going to leave to go to Seattle where he would have total organizational control, he returned for 1 more year in Green Bay as head coach. Like everybody else with Green Bay, they were determined to make amends for their disappointing Super Bowl loss the year before. Favre was still in his prime and threw 10 touchdowns during Green Bay's 4-0 start, and things were looking a lot like 96 and 97. But in Green Bay's 5th game at home on Monday Night Football versus Minnesota, things began to go south. Favre threw 3 interceptions in a 37-24 loss, but as it turned out, 1998 would belong to the Vikings, at least until the NFC Championship game. Wink. They added a rookie named Randy Moss and finished 15-1 with the best offense ever. Green Bay was unsurprisingly swept by them and therefore had 0 shot at the division title or a home playoff game. It still had a respectable 11-5 season, and Favre once again finished with over 30 touchdown passes, but he threw a staggering 23 interceptions, including 22 over the last 13 games. He was still an elite quarterback, but no longer the undisputed MVP. For the 4th straight season, they would face the 49ers in the playoffs, a team that they, and more specifically Favre, had owned. Maybe there was hope after all. In a game that would become known as the Catch-2, there were plenty of fumbles, interceptions, and a controversial non-fumble call on Jerry Rice late that would have sealed the win for Green Bay. 7 turnovers overall, the first of which was a TO fumble that set up a Green Bay field goal to go up 3-0. But a Dorsey Levens fumble would set up a Steve Young touchdown pass to put San Fran up 7-3 temporarily until Favre found Antonio Freeman to regain the lead 10-7. Young threw an interception, but Green Bay couldn't capitalize on it, and San Fran tied it at 10 with a field goal. A missed field goal by Green Bay was followed by another Young interception, and this time Green Bay did capitalize with a touchdown run by Levens to take a 17-10 lead into halftime. A Favre interception to start the third was turned into another Young touchdown pass to tie the game at 17, and San Fran eventually took a 20-17 lead into the fourth, where Green Bay tied it with a field goal to make it 20-all. San Fran retook the lead with another field goal, then Favre threw his second interception of the day to seemingly bury Green Bay, but San Fran did nothing with it. 4:19 left, down 3. Favre had one of the few clutch postseason drives of his career, finding Freeman on a go-ahead touchdown with 1:55 left to put Green Bay up 27-23. But nobody remembers that. They remember a Jerry Rice fumble not being called, and then, of course, Steve Young's 25-yard game-winning touchdown pass to Terrell Owens with 8 seconds left to knock Green Bay out of the playoffs. This would be the last time Favre ever came through in the clutch of a playoff loss, and, more importantly, it was also the end of the Mike Holmgren era, as he'd leave to go to Seattle. Although both Favre and Holmgren would still be successful without the other, neither ever won another Super Bowl, and Favre would never again be as consistently great as he was under Holmgren. 1999. The Packers replaced Holmgren with Ray Rhodes, a former Green Bay defensive coordinator who had just been fired off of a 3-13 season with the Eagles. Safe to say the reaction in Green Bay was not that enthusiastic. Despite the massive downgrade at head coach, Green Bay started the season off 3-1 thanks to the most clutch 4-game stretch of Favre's career. He threw game-winning touchdowns with 11 seconds left versus Oakland in Week 1, 12 seconds left versus Minnesota in Week 3, and 1:05 left versus Tampa in Week 5. But regression is a bitch. Favre had the lowest passer rating in any game of his career that he started and finished versus Denver in Week 6, going 7 of 23 with no touchdowns and 3 interceptions for a 9.6 rating in a blowout loss. He rebounded with a blowout win versus San Diego to put Green Bay at 4-2 with Mike Holmgren returning to town. Favre would be horrible, throwing 4 interceptions in a blowout home loss. The next 2 weeks would see heartbreak continue. In a competitive home bout versus rival Chicago, Favre had 2 drives down 14-13 in the fourth. The first ended in a punt, but the second ended with a blocked 28-yard field goal as time expired to send Green Bay to a 4-4 record. The next week versus old rival Dallas on the road, Favre almost staged a late rally, but down 20-13 in the last minute, he threw a game-losing pick-6 to send Green Bay to a 27-13 loss and a 4-5 record. A 3-game win streak calmed some of the hot seat talk for Rhodes, but only for a moment, as Green Bay then dropped 3 in a row, including back-to-back heartbreakers versus Carolina and Minnesota. Favre actually played well versus Carolina in the fourth quarter, leading a touchdown drive that gave Green Bay a 31-27 lead with 4 minutes left, but Green Bay's defense gave up a 13-play, 63-yard touchdown drive, capped off by a game-winning touchdown run by Steve Berline as time expired to send Green Bay to a 33-31 loss. The next week versus Minnesota, Favre had 3 drives, down 4 to do something, but the first ended in a punt, and the last 2 ended in interceptions, sending Green Bay to a 24-20 loss and a 7-7 record. With their playoff hopes dwindling, they needed a monster performance versus Tampa, and they certainly didn't get it. Despite taking a 10-9 halftime lead, Green Bay put up 0 points on 7 second-half drives to lose 29-10. Green Bay would avoid a losing season by blowing out the terrible Arizona Cardinals 49-24 in Week 17, but missed the playoffs thanks to a conference record tiebreaker with division rival Detroit. Favre had another 4,000-yard season, but just 22 touchdowns to 23 interceptions and a 74.7 rating. Rhodes was fired after the season, going 1-done, and Mike Sherman was hired in his place. 2000. The world didn't end in Y2K, but it felt like it did in Green Bay after the disappointing 1999 season ended without a playoff appearance. Surely that would not happen 2 years in a row with Brett Favre at its physical peak, right? Well, actually, the 2000 season was marked by incredible inconsistency on the part of both team and Favre himself once again. Some weeks, Favre looked like MVP Favre, others like the inconsistent 99 Favre. Injuries played a role for sure, but Favre once again had his problems in crunch time. In Week 1 versus the Jets, he threw a game-losing interception down 20-16. A sneaky blowout loss to Buffalo in Week 2 dropped Green Bay to 0-2. Then a disgustingly ugly 6-3 win over Philly occurred in Week 3. Favre got a game-winning drive, but that was after he threw 2 interceptions with the game tied in the fourth, so it's one of the most unclutch game-winning drives ever recorded. Green Bay got to 2-2 before dropping back-to-back games versus Chicago and Detroit, in which Favre had chances in the fourth to win or tie. Versus Chicago, he turned the ball over on downs, down 27-24 to lose. Then he threw 2 interceptions in the fourth, down 7 versus Detroit to lose 31-24. A vintage MVP performance followed in a win over San Fran before the Bugaboos returned versus Miami, as Favre had an interception and turnover on downs on 2 fourth-quarter drives down 8 in the fourth quarter to lose the game. The infamous "he did what?" Antonio Freeman Monday Night Football game versus Minnesota happened the next week to put Green Bay at 4-5. After that, a 20-15 15 road loss to Tampa, where Favre left early with an injury, dropped them to 4-6. A win over Peyton Manning's Colts the next week injected some life temporarily into the team, but a 31-14 blowout loss to Carolina, where Green Bay went scoreless on its final 7 drives, all but ended their playoff hopes. Green Bay would, in fact, win out, finish 9-7 and a winning record, but it was too late. The top 6 teams in the NFC finished 10-6 or better, and if Favre had been able to come through in the clutch, particularly on opening day versus the Jets, 31-24 loss to the Lions, and the 27-24 home loss to the Bears, well, maybe they would have made the playoffs. Overall, Favre finished with a mediocre 20 touchdowns to 16 interceptions for a mediocre 78 passer rating. It was his second straight mediocre season with no playoffs, and people were officially beginning to wonder whether or not he was washed up. 2001 would see a return to form for both Favre and the Packers. Favre finished with 32 touchdowns to 15 interceptions for a 94.1 rating and a 7.02 adjusted net yards per attempt. He finished third in MVP and was second team All-Pro. Not only that, but the Packers finished 12-4. However, despite going 12-4, they failed to win their division thanks to a fluke 13-3 season by the Bears. This is interesting because the Packers swept the Bears, but Chicago went 13-1 in their other 14 games to snag the 2 seed behind St. Louis. Even though this would be one of the best regular seasons of Favre's career, he still had some missteps in crunch time that could have given Green Bay a better record. After starting the season 3-0 in dominant fashion, Green Bay lost to a dominant Tampa defense in Week 4. Favre threw 3 interceptions, including 1 down 4 in the 4th. He also turned it over on downs, down 4, in a 14-10 loss. Favre then had one of the best games of his career versus Baltimore, throwing for 337 yards, 3 touchdowns, and a 137.4 rating against the defending champs and a top 4 defense in 2001. A puzzling blowout loss to Minnesota on the road dropped Green Bay to 4-2, but they would bounce back to go to 6-2. But then another shocking loss occurred in Week 10 versus Atlanta at home. Green Bay lost as 10-point favorite, and Favre crapped himself in crunch time. With 3 drives in the 4th down 3, he led Green Bay's offense to 2 punts and a game-ending interception to seal the 23-20 loss. Green Bay bounced back to reel off 3 straight wins to make it to 9-3, giving them the edge over Chicago for the moment, but the next week versus a 5-7 Tennessee team, as 2.5-point road favorites, Green Bay stumbled again. Favre had a drive down 5 in the 4th, but punted. He also had a drive late down 6 with a chance to steal the win, but he had to punt again in a 26-20 loss, dropping Green Bay to 9-4. Although Green Bay would win out to finish 12-4, as stated before, it was not enough to win the division or get a first-round bye, since Chicago also won out. Green Bay's reward was yet another playoff matchup with the 49ers, who, just like Green Bay, had missed the playoffs in both 99 and 2000. Steve Young and Jerry Rice were both gone from San Fran by this point, but while Jeff Garcia was no Montana or Young, he was no joke either, and Terrell Owens had evolved into a top 2 or 3 receiver in the league, which was a big reason why they had finished 12-4 just like Green Bay. As many expected, the game was competitive. Favre gave Green Bay a 6-0 lead, but Green Bay trailed 7-6 at halftime thanks to a missed extra point. Favre would take over in the second half though, leading Green Bay on a field goal and touchdown drive in the 3rd to take a 15-7 lead into the 4th. San Fran fought back, tying the game at 15 on an 8-point drive before Favre again led a field goal drive. Jeff Garcia then threw an interception before Green Bay pushed the lead to 10 to seal the win 25-15. It improved Favre's playoff record versus San Fran to 4-1, and it really should be 5-0 if the refs correctly ruled the Jerry Rice fumble in 98. Just saying. Packers would then travel to Missouri to face the best team in the league, the 14-2 Rams, aka the greatest show on turf. On this day, Favre would end up throwing 5 touchdown passes. The problem is that 3 of them were to the other team, and the bigger problem is that those 3 interceptions only account for half of the interceptions Favre had overall. That's right, Favre threw 6 interceptions in this 45-17 laugher. We look at this game now and say, well, yeah, that's typical playoff Favre, but in 2001, this was really shocking, because up to this point, Favre had started 15 playoff games and was legitimately one of the best postseason quarterbacks ever. Yes, it's true. Nobody saw 6 interceptions coming. This, to me, was the official start of the second half of Favre's playoff career. Long gone was the man who started 9-3 with a Super Bowl ring and 2 Super Bowl appearances. For the rest of his career starting at this point, Favre would always be the biggest reason his teams failed to make the Super Bowl. Nobody knew it though at the time, as this was just seen as a hiccup in a great season by a great quarterback. 2002 remains one of the weirdest years of Favre's career. His team was tied for the best record in the NFL, yet didn't even get a first-round bye. He was MVP runner-up and second-team All-Pro, yet his numbers were far worse than they were in 2001 or any of his other MVP seasons. Favre began the season on fire, throwing 14 touchdowns to 3 interceptions for a 102.5 rating through first 6 games, but then he sprained his LCL in his left knee versus Washington and was never quite the same the rest of the year, and the numbers proved it. Through 9 games, he had Green Bay at 8-1 and a 101.7 rating. He was the front runner for MVP, and then he individually fell off a cliff, needing his ground game and defense to pick up the slack. Back-to-back losses to Minnesota and Tampa proved costly, as both were winnable in the fourth quarter, and Favre couldn't come through either time, including a game-losing interception to Tampa, dropping Green Bay to 8-3. Green Bay would then win 4 in a row to get to 12-3, despite Favre averaging just 5.4 yards per attempt in those games. Nevertheless, all Green Bay had to do to get home field advantage throughout the playoffs was defeat an 8-7 Jets team in the final week of the season. So much promise and hope would be slammed shut emphatically. Green Bay made it a 14-10 game at halftime, but their defense didn't show up and Favre's struggles continued. Before anybody knew it, Green Bay had lost 42-17, dropping them to 12-4 and the 3 seed due to conference record tiebreakers. They would still get a home game in the wildcard round versus the Falcons and were 6.5 point favorites, as they had never lost at Lambeau in the playoffs, and many wrote off the Jets' loss as a fluke. Well, it wasn't. Right from the very start, the Falcons jumped on Green Bay. Michael Vick, famous Humane Society worker, led an opening drive touchdown, while Favre threw an opening drive interception. Then Atlanta returned a blocked punt for a touchdown. Then Green Bay missed a field goal, which Atlanta scored another touchdown off of. Before anybody knew it, Atlanta was up 21-0 20 minutes into the game. It would expand to 24-0 at halftime before Favre threw a touchdown to Donald Driver early in the third for Green Bay's only points of the game. Atlanta added another field goal to go up 27-7 late in the third. Then another missed field goal by Green Bay all but sealed the game entering the fourth. Favre had 4 drives in the fourth quarter, all down by 20, and they ended with turnover on downs, a fumble, an interception, and another fumble. No 28-3 comeback this time. Before anybody knew it, Green Bay's season was over without a playoff win. Favre had just turned 33, which was old for a quarterback back in 2002, and for the first time, whispers about his age and retirement had started swirling. 2003 could only be described as a whirlwind for the Packers and Favre. Most will always remember this season for Favre's legendary performance on Monday Night Football versus the Raiders after his father passed away. But the storylines go much deeper than just that one. Despite having Favre at quarterback, the Packers were ranked 27th in pass attempts and an absolutely dominant running team thanks largely to Ahman Green. Some of this was by design by coach Mike Sherman, and some of it was due to a broken thumb Favre was playing through to keep his consecutive start streak alive. Despite limited attempts, Favre led the league in touchdown passes for the 4th time. He also somehow found a way to throw 21 interceptions. Unlike prior seasons where it was obvious Green Bay was going to make the playoffs, it literally took until the final week of the season and a lot of luck to barely squeak Green Bay in. Green Bay finished 10-6 and won the NFC North despite Minnesota starting 6-0. One familiar trend that continued though? Favre struggles in crunch time. Let's take a look. Week 3 versus Arizona, he threw a game-losing interception down 7 to drop Green Bay to 1-2. Week 6 versus Kansas City, he helped Green Bay blow a 31-14 lead to lose 40-34 in overtime to drop Green Bay to 3-3. Week 10 versus Philly, he fumbled the game away down 3 to lose 17-14 to drop Green Bay to 4-5. Finally, in Week 13 versus Detroit, on 4 fourth-quarter drives, he produced 0 points, including 2 interceptions to lose 22-14 and drop Green Bay to 6-6. Now, Green Bay would win their last 4 games, including the Monday Night Football game versus the Raiders, to finish 10-6, and thanks to Arizona upsetting Minnesota with a touchdown on the final play of the season, Green Bay got into the dance and even a home playoff game, where they would face a familiar foe in Mike Holmgren. Favre had a very good game and helped Green Bay get to a 13-6 halftime lead, but Seattle would not go down easy. No offense to Nancy Reagan. The tiptoe burglar, Sean Alexander, scored 2 touchdowns in a row from the 1-yard line in the third to put Seattle up 20-13, but Ahman Green did his own tiptoe burgling, scoring 2 1-yard touchdown runs of his own to put Green Bay back up 27-20. But the OG burglar was not fazed, punching in another 1-yard run with 51 seconds left to tie the game. Favre set up Green Bay with a 47-yard game-winning field goal attempt as time expired, but it was no good, and the game went into overtime, where Matt Hasselbeck, former Packer, famously said,
"Seattle has won the toss. We won the ball, we're going to score."
Seattle won the coin toss and the teams exchanged punts before Hasselbeck threw a season-ending interception to Al Harris to send Green Bay to the divisional round to face Philadelphia. The Eagles never led for a single second in their divisional round matchup versus Green Bay, so they obviously lost, right? Well, Favre started off the game on fire, throwing 2 touchdowns to put Green Bay up 14-0 after the first quarter. Was Green Bay really going to do it? Were they really going to run the table and shock the world? This game is famous for how it ended, but there were monster key moments that everybody forgets, such as Ahman Green getting stuffed on the 1-yard line late in the second second quarter that would have put Green Bay up 21-7. Philly eventually tied the game at 14 early in the fourth, and Favre eventually connected on a 44-yard bomb to set up a first and goal at the Philadelphia 7, but couldn't get a touchdown out of it and had to settle for a field goal to go up by just 3 with 10:25 left. Green Bay got the ball back up 3 and ran off 5 minutes of the game clock to set up a 4th and 1 at the Philadelphia 41-yard line. Instead of going for it and sealing the win, Mike Sherman decided to punt like a little bitch, which set up the famous 4th and 26 play by Donovan McNabb to Freddie Mitchell. Philadelphia eventually kicked a field goal as time expired to send the game into overtime. Philadelphia won the coin toss but had to punt. And up to this point, Favre had been surprisingly mistake-free and was on the verge of his first NFC Championship game appearance since 1997. But you are who you are. And on Green Bay's possession, Favre threw up a truly terrible interception, which was returned to set up Philadelphia in field goal range, which they converted to win 20-17, ending Green Bay's season that had given their fans so much false hope. Of all the playoff losses Favre had after 98, I would say this was the one he deserves the least blame for, despite the interception. Mike Sherman being a coward and not going for it on 4th and 1 at the Philly 41 for the chance to clinch the game, and Favre's defense giving up a 4th and 26 are bigger reasons they lost than Favre's interception. God damn, that was still a fucking dumb interception. Hard to believe, but this would be Favre's best playoff run and the closest he would get to a Super Bowl in the 9-year window between 98 and 2006. 2004 was by far the worst defense Favre ever had in his career. So, in a way, Green Bay finishing 10-6 and winning the NFC North is a testament to his greatness, as is throwing for over 4,000 yards and 30 touchdowns, although in typical Favre fashion, he also had 17 interceptions. The NFC was extremely weak in 2004, and considering Favre's season, Green Bay should have been able to get a first-round bye, but they had to settle for the 3 seed behind Philly and Atlanta, the only other 2 teams in the NFC that year to win double-digit games. Oddly enough, there weren't really any close losses in the regular season where Favre was at fault. The Packers either lost big, or Favre never got the ball with the score tied or down 1 score in the fourth quarter, except in a shootout versus Indy in week 3. Starting the season 1-4 certainly didn't help, but they finished 9-2 over their last 11 games, including 2 wins over Minnesota, where Favre was spectacular. So getting an 8-8 Vikings team for a third time at home in the wildcard round was seen as a bye of sorts, but it would lead to 2 things: heartbreak for Green Bay and one of the most hilarious sound bites of all time. Before anybody could even get to their cold-ass seats in Lambeau, Minnesota took a 14-0 lead thanks to 2 Dante Culpepper touchdown passes. Favre went into panic mode, throwing his first of 4 interceptions on the day, which led to a Minnesota field goal to put Green Bay into a 17-0 deficit. Favre would calm down and Green Bay would reel off 10 straight points to make it 17-10 early in the second, but Favre's second interception would lead to another Culpepper touchdown pass to make it 24-10 Minnesota. Favre led a long drive that ended with a missed 28-yard field goal with Ryan Longwell. Third quarter saw Green Bay's defense step up, but it didn't matter because Favre threw 2 more interceptions to reach 4 on the day. Despite it all, Green Bay had the score at 24-17 early in the fourth after a touchdown run, but Minnesota answered right back with the second Culpepper-Moss connection of the day, which led to the greatest moment in the history of the United States.
That is a disgusting act by Randy Moss. That is disgusting by Randy Moss. Well, let's get back to the play.
Despite 10 minutes being left, Favre would get only 1 more drive, which ended in a punt because Mike Sherman was a coward. Anyway, Minnesota then drained the remaining time to seal the shocking 31-17 win. Although considering Favre's postseason play after 2001, it really wasn't that shocking anymore. Despite a bad defense, I believe it was Favre's constant meltdowns in the clutch in the postseason that forced Green Bay to pick some weirdo quarterback from California in the first round of the 05 draft. 2005. Drafting Aaron Rodgers must have really done a number mentally on Favre because his 2005 numbers are truly the stuff of legend and not in a good way. Putting it simply, Favre was so bad in crunch time in 2005 that you could accuse him of purposely throwing games. Now, that's a big accusation even for somebody like Favre, but, well, just watch this. Yes, I'm throwing up as well. In all, in the 2005 season, when tied or trailing by 1 to 8 points in the fourth quarter, Brett Favre had 0 touchdowns, 10 interceptions, a 21 passer rating, and a negative 2.5 adjusted net yards per attempt. Over the last 10 games of the season specifically, Favre had 6 touchdowns to 26 turnovers. Any other quarterback would have been benched, especially if their team had just drafted a quarterback in the first round like the Packers had. But nobody wanted to be the one to snap Favre's Iron Man streak. And thus, after the season, Mike Sherman was fired and replaced by another Mike, one far more fatter and sweatier. 2006. A new head coach didn't do much to improve Favre's performance in 2006. Sure, he didn't throw 29 interceptions and Green Bay improved from 4-12 to 8-8, but Favre was still below average statistically, finishing with 18 touchdowns to 18 interceptions and a 72.7 rating. There weren't as many clutch blunders by Favre in 06 as there were in 05, but there were still many missed opportunities. Versus New Orleans, Favre had 3 drives with a chance to tie or take the lead, and he punted, fumbled, and then turned it over on downs in a 34-27 loss. Versus the Rams, down 7, he punted, then down 3, he punted, and then down 3 again, he fumbled in a 23-20 defeat. Versus Buffalo, the score tied at 10, he punted, and then down 7, he threw an interception in a 24-10 defeat. And then finally, versus Seattle, down 6, he could only muster a field goal drive in a game the Packers lost 34-24. Those 4 games would be huge. And even though the Pack won their last 4 games to avoid a losing season, they still had a chance to make the playoffs in the last week, and if any of those 4 games that I described had gone the other way, the Pack would have been in the postseason. But they were eliminated when the fellow 8-8 Giants won, and therefore had a tiebreaker over the Packers due to conference win percentage. Many thought that Favre was going to retire, but with him being so close to breaking the all-time touchdown pass and passing yards marks, it was pretty dumb to think that, honestly. Besides, 2007 would prove that Favre still had plenty of good football left in him, but also the same demons. 2007. 2007 was an extremely unexpected return to MVP form for Favre. It really was the most magical regular season he could have possibly asked for, besides getting hurt and losing to Dallas and Rodgers coming in and playing well, which gave the team the confidence to move on from him after the season, but we'll get to that in a bit. Favre broke Marino's touchdown and yards records, and he did so while being uncharacteristically consistent and actually performing well in the clutch. He was once again MVP runner-up and prevented Tom Brady, from winning unanimously. Favre had 10 games with a passer rating over 100, and although he still had a few patented stinkers thrown in, he was legitimately great, and he was the biggest reason Green Bay went 13-3 and got the 2 seed and its first round bye since 1997. Favre's great season carried over to the first playoff game, where he once again defeated his old sensei Mike Holmgren with a steady, razor-sharp game-managing performance, 3 touchdowns and no interceptions for a 137.6 rating, while his running back Ryan Grant ran for over 200 yards and 3 touchdowns. News got even better in the land of the cheese the next day, as the Giants upset the 1-seeded Cowboys, meaning the NFC Championship game would be played at Lambeau for the first time since 1996, the only year Favre ever won it all. This was also just the second and last time Favre would ever host a conference championship game in his career. The 2007 NFC Championship game was played after the Patriots' run game and defense heroically overcame Tom Brady, throwing 3 interceptions to defeat a San Diego team with a quarterback on a torn ACL and future Hall of Fame running back LaDainian Tomlinson out in the AFC Championship game. All Favre and the 7.5-point home favorites had to do was beat a team with a glorified Rex Grossman at quarterback to meet up with Brady in Arizona for Super Bowl 42. But the thing is, Rex Grossman won his NFC Championship game, defeating a future first-ballot Hall of Fame quarterback in Drew Brees. Surely a 26-year-old former SEC quarterback who threw for 23 touchdowns, 20 interceptions, and a 73.9 rating wouldn't win the NFC Championship game against a future first-ballot Hall of Fame quarterback for 2 years in a row, right? Considering how cold it was during the game, the Packers' supposed advantage throwing the ball at quarterback was nullified for the most part. Green Bay began the game at 3 straight punts to trail 6-0 before breaking through with a 90-yard touchdown pass from Favre to Donald Driver to take a 7-6 lead in the second. Green Bay's defense remained strong as the Pack added a field goal to take a 10-6 halftime lead. But the Giants came out to start the second half with a long touchdown drive to go up 13-10. Favre, however, would respond with a touchdown drive of his own, throwing his second touchdown of the day, this time to Donald Lee, to go up 17-13. Not enough scoring for you, you, huh? Well, Eli Manning led another touchdown drive to take back the lead 20-17 heading into the fourth quarter. Green Bay would kick a field goal early in the fourth to tie the game at 20 after a Favre interception was fumbled back to the Packers, the same thing Favre benefited from against the Giants in 1992. Remember that from the beginning of the video? Yeah, time is a flat circle. Lawrence Tynes decided to play kickers being dickheads at the worst possible time for the Giants, missing a 43-yard field goal and a 36-yard field goal as time expired to send the game into overtime. Favre had not one, but two chances with the score tied at 20, but punted each time, eerily reminiscent of him failing to capitalize when tied in the fourth quarter versus Denver in Super Bowl 32 10 years earlier. Favre will get a third chance, though, as Green Bay won the overtime coin toss. After a 2-yard first down run, Favre proceeded to undo all the great things he had done that season by throwing a terrible interception to the Giants cornerback Corey Webster deep in Packers territory. The Giants' quote-unquote game-winning drive was 5 yards, and unlike Favre, Tynes would not fail on his third try, nailing a 47-yard field goal to win the game and officially end the Favre era in Green Bay. You all know the story by now. About a month later, Favre quote-unquote retired in an emotional press conference, went back to Mississippi to take some dong pics, probably, then decided he wanted to come back to play for 2008 in Green Bay just as training camp was starting. The problem was the Packers had already moved on to Aaron Rodgers as a starter, which was a pretty solid move, I'd say, looking back. I also found this quote to be interesting, as it supports what I said about post-Holmgren Favre not being a quarterback you could win a championship with. We all know now that all-time Rodgers is better than Favre, or, if you're a Favre nutcase, just as great as Favre was at the absolute worst. I just want to point out that as somebody who remembers this drama in real time back in 2008, how fucking improbable it is to say out loud now in 2024. If you told somebody Rodgers would become better than Favre all time in 2008, they would admit you to a psych ward, and for good reason. All Rodgers had to show for his first 3 seasons was a few good drives versus Dallas, whereas Favre just showed he was still great and was a top 5 to 10 quarterback ever. The chances of Rodgers becoming as good as he actually ended up becoming were nigh impossible. I just think we forget this sometimes because Rodgers won his only Super Bowl early on and then he started winning MVPs, so we just got used to him always being great, which kind of made people think that he was always a sure thing, and that was not the case. Although, as an aside, Rodgers' career and life has become way too much like Favre's in all the wrong ways. Anyways, back to football, that's why you're here. Not wanting to be Rodgers' backup, Favre demanded a trade to Minnesota, but the Packers front office trolled him by sending him to the New York Jets instead, a shitty team in another conference, which is weird because it was Green Bay's way of admitting that they knew Favre was still good and they didn't want to play against him, but at the same time he also wasn't good enough to start for them anymore. It was all frustrating and confusing, much like Favre's first and only season in the Big Apple. 2008. Favre's one season with the Jets, call him Jet Favre, am I right, was an absolute roller coaster. At the start, there was great promise, especially after Tom Brady went down for the season in Week 1, essentially guaranteeing the Jets would win the AFC East. Favre even had a career-high 6 touchdown passes versus the eventual NFC champion Cardinals in Week 4, but following an extremely disappointing loss to the Jamarcus Russell-led Raiders in overtime, where Favre punted away several chances to win literally, the Jets sat at just 3-3. To date, the season was a disappointment, but then the Jets righted the ship, no offense to the Titanic, winning 5 in a row, including back-to-back road wins over the Patriots and previously undefeated Titans to get to 8-3. But outside of Favre's 6 touchdown game, the Jets offense was really powered by its run game, which was top 5 in the league in both yards per carry and touchdowns. But, perhaps to appease Favre, they were just 19th in rushing attempts. Interesting. At some point, entering the home stretch, Favre tore his biceps in his throwing arm, and being a guy who valued his Iron Man streak over anything else, he played through it, and the results were ugly as shit. No offense to Lizzo. The Jets went 1-4. Favre threw 2 touchdowns and 9 interceptions with a 55.2 rating. Despite this, the Jets had chances to win versus San Francisco and Seattle, but wasted them both. But the real kick in the nuts was the Week 17 de facto playoff game versus Miami at home versus former Jets quarterback Chad Pennington. Favre would throw a pick-6 and 3 interceptions in total, having 2 drives in the fourth quarter to potentially win the game, but it ended with a punt and then an interception to drop the Jets to 9-7 and out of the playoffs, which honestly they wouldn't have made anyway even if they had won, because the Patriots and the Ravens both won the last week. Like the previous year with Green Bay, Favre announced his retirement after the year, but unlike previous season, the Jets would release Favre from his contract in late April, allowing him to sign with any team. And to nobody's surprise, Favre signed with the Vikings in mid-August to begin his revenge tour against the Packers, which is what he wanted all along. 2009. With his third team in 3 years at the ripe old age of 40, Brett Favre pulled one of the best seasons of his career out of his ass. It was as though 2008 had never happened and he picked right back up where he left off from his MVP caliber 2007 season. The Vikings had the best running back in the league in Adrian Peterson, Peterson, kid respecter, and an elite defense. They added the dynamic Percy Harvin in the draft, and Favre would help Sidney Rice emerge as a Pro Bowl wide receiver. Favre had a ridiculous game-winning touchdown pass to beat the 49ers, destroyed the Packers on Monday Night Football, and also tore up an elite Baltimore defense to get Minnesota off to a 6-0 start. But the bad Favre made an appearance versus Pittsburgh, committing a fumble 6 and pick 6 in the fourth quarter to lose. Every regular season loss in this particular season was crucial as the Saints began the year 13-0 and finished 13-3 in the NFC. A 4-game win streak followed, including Favre's much-anticipated return to Lambeau, where he again tore Green Bay a new asshole, throwing for 4 touchdowns in a 38-26 win. Sitting at 10-1, Minnesota was in good shape, but they would hit a rough patch, losing 3 of their next 4 games. The first to the defending NFC champs, Arizona, on the road, but the 2 that hurt the most were a 26-7 loss to Carolina while being 9-point road favorites, and then losing again as 8.5-point road favorites to a shitty Jay Cutler Bears team on Monday Night Football. Favre actually played well, but with 2 drives tied at 30, he came up with 0 points, and Cutler eventually threw the game-winning touchdown pass in overtime. Despite all of this, they ended the season strong, destroying the Giants to finish 12-4 and snag the 2 seed and a first-round bye. Their first playoff game would be against Dallas, and it turned out to be a complete role reversal of Favre's 90s playoff matchups with them. Favre threw for 4 touchdowns and a stellar 134.4 rating, while Minnesota's defense held Dallas to 3 turnovers and a dominant 34-3 win. The win set up Favre's 5th career NFC Championship game appearance, a road matchup with the Saints. For all intents and purposes, it would be the last meaningful game of Favre's career. 2009 NFC Championship game was a game of mistakes. Minnesota put up 28 points and almost 500 yards of offense, but committed a staggering 5 turnovers and 6 fumbles, 3 of which were lost. The game began as a shootout. Minnesota scored, then New Orleans answered, and then Minnesota scored again to make it 14-7 Minnesota after 1. Minnesota would get 5 drives in the second quarter, but 0 points, and their first lost fumble came inside the Saints' 4-yard line. New Orleans tied it to make it 14-14 at halftime. The teams would then exchange touchdown drives to start the second half to make it 21-21. Then the fuckery really started. Favre threw an interception, then Percy Harvin fumbled deep in Minnesota territory, which the Saints turned into a touchdown to go up 28-21. Minnesota's next drive went 70 yards, but ended with another lost fumble, this time by Bernard Berrien. Minnesota would then get a stop and respond with a touchdown to make it 28-28 with 5 minutes left. Another Minnesota defense stop set up Favre with a chance to return to the Super Bowl for the first time in 12 years. Favre moved Minnesota into field goal range and then, as he'd done so many times before, threw a boneheaded interception at the worst possible time to send the game into overtime. Favre would never get a chance to redeem himself as the Saints won the overtime coin toss and kicked the game-winning field goal to advance to Super Bowl 44, leaving Favre in the dust, take a bunch of sad dong picks by himself. 2010. After quote-unquote retiring yet again, Favre finally came back for the 2010 season at age 41 and year 20, just as the preseason began. With all their main pieces returning from 2009, Minnesota was rightfully expected to be Super Bowl contenders. But the problem was, Favre regressed from MVP candidate to, well, how you'd expect a 41-year-old quarterback to play, which was terrible. Minnesota started 0-2, putting up just 19 combined points, with Favre choking in the fourth quarter both games. In what was a wild season, the Vikings signed Randy Moss, bringing the 2 Hall of Famers together about 10 years too late. And they even connected on a touchdown in their first game together, a loss to Favre's former team, the Jets, where Favre had 3 touchdown passes, but another pesky game-losing pick-6 in the fourth, to lose 29-20. A few weeks later, while standing at 2-3, Favre returned to Lambeau again, and unlike 2009, was not sharp, throwing 3 interceptions, including a pick-6, but after connecting with Moss on another touchdown, had the score at 28-24 Packers entering the fourth. On 2 fourth-quarter drives, Favre threw another interception, and then on Minnesota's final drive had a touchdown overturned, and then turned it over on downs to lose to the eventual Super Bowl champs. The next week after that, they traveled to New England, who were Randy Moss's former team, and had just released him a few weeks prior. Favre played decent, but had to leave the game early as Minnesota lost 28-18 to fall to 2-5. The Vikings cut Moss after the game, and then Favre's last great game came the next week against the lowly Cardinals, where he threw for a career-high 446 yards and led an improbable 14-point comeback in the final 4 minutes to win 27-24. But the celebration was short-lived, as 2 bad losses in a row to Chicago and the Packers sealed head coach Brad Childress' fate, as he was fired as Minnesota dropped to 3-7. With the season loss, Favre continued to play through various injuries until he finally got knocked out early with a shoulder sprain in a win versus Buffalo. This caused him to finally miss a game on Monday Night Football versus the Giants and ended his 321 consecutive start streak. Favre would return a week later again on Monday Night Football versus the Bears, but would suffer a concussion early in the second quarter and never returned in a blowout loss. He sat out the last 2 games as Minnesota finished an unbelievably disappointing 6-10 to finally, mercifully, bring an end to his historic 20-year NFL career. This time, there would be no more unretirements. Oh, wow, hey, you're still here. Wow, thank you. Anyway, so I wanted to take a look at some stats from Favre that I looked up and that I made. And you guys are familiar with my adjusted value stat, where I basically see how many yards and how much yardage and value a quarterback added based on the level of opponents they were playing and based on the amount of value. And this is Favre's chart, and you can see the inconsistencies just stick out. Obviously, red's bad, green's good. The inconsistency is just ridiculous, even in chart form. And you can obviously tell when his MVP years were 3 straight years over 1,000, which is 1,000 DAV. I call it DAV in a season is a phenomenal season. And so I put it in chronological order. I also put it from best to worst, and his great was really great, and then you can see his bad was really bad, very inconsistent. To me, the interesting one I look at his playoff career, and this is the most interesting to me because you can really tell exactly when he went from being a great playoff quarterback all the way up until the 2001 49ers game. Through that game, he was one of the best playoff quarterbacks of all time, and then you see a couple huge negative red games and then a bunch of other mediocre games that he lost and a bunch of losses. So I think that this stat of mine does a pretty good job of capturing how good or bad a player did, and it doesn't focus on just one play. Still some tweaks to be worked out, but I think it's pretty good. Anyway, so I went and I did this same thing, only I compared it with where he ranked in passer rating and adjusted net yards per attempt, which are really adjusted net yards per attempt, I'd say is the biggest stat here you got to look at. And you look at the chart, you can see the MVP seasons. He was first, second, and second, and it matches up again. Matches up pretty well, correlates pretty well with what I'm doing. I just love, you can see how just unbelievably inconsistent from really starting in, you look at 04, and then you look at the swings from 05 to 06, and then he goes back up. He peaks in 07, and then 2008 is the worst year of his career relative to the competition, and then he has one of the best seasons. He has the best regular season of his career in 2009, and then he fell back down to earth again. Just so many interesting, he had such an interesting career, Favre. And here it is individually. You can see again, correlates pretty well. A lot of his best seasons, he finished super high in just net yards per attempt and passer rating. Not really a surprise here, but I just thought it'd be interesting to put it in a quantitative way. But that's Favre as an individual. This is Favre as how his teams performed. And it's really interesting and odd. I say it's interesting a lot, just in case you haven't noticed. But I think it's weird because when we think of Favre, it's almost like he's a team in and of himself. When we think of him as a quarterback, we don't kind of look at the other guys. Oh, Favre threw an interception, Favre threw these touchdowns, more than other quarterbacks, at least in my experience. So I think looking at his teams, how they performed offensively, you can see in his prime, for the most part, really outside of a couple years like 05 and 06 specifically, and 2010, his last year, his offense has always put up a lot of points. And he did really well moving the ball. I mean, this is why he's a Hall of Fame quarterback. He wasn't a terrible player. He just was, he was inconsistent as shit. But overall, on average, he finished top 10 points, 10th in points, 11th in yards. The field position, I think, is the one to look at, because that is where you can really see, and I think it also speaks very well of all the turnovers he had, all the interceptions and fumbles. And so despite finishing pretty well in points and yards, he finished 17th on average in field position. Now this only goes back to 1998. It's not, the per possession data isn't available on Pro Football Reference before 1998. So the first 6 years of Favre's career as a starter, there's nothing to go by. But you can tell a lot of these years very, very poor in average starting field position because he was so turnover prone. Then I look at things like defense, and I was honestly stunned by how many good defenses or how many not terrible defenses Favre had, especially considering, again, he turned the ball over so much. You would expect, oh, well, he must have a bunch of defenses where they gave up a shitload of points and blah, blah, blah. Not really. I mean, outside 1999 wasn't very good. 2004 was a bad one. But other than that, you got a lot of great, good, and basically just mediocre defenses. So on average, he finished 12th, which is better than guys like Peyton and Rodgers and Breeze and Mahomes. So his defensive support for his career wasn't lacking. And same thing with yards. Look at the yards per drive. It was even better. He finished 11th on average. So, but again, field position is the one area you can probably see affected most by his interceptions, and he finished 18th on average there. So there's a sense that if Favre hadn't been so turnover prone, maybe his defenses could have have been even better than they were. So who knows? But there's some potential there for some mediocre defenses that could have been possibly even better. And that's a reason why Favre only had 4 first-round buys in 19 years. You think about all the games he won, all the records he had. 4 first-round buys in 19 years as a starter. 96, 97, 2007, and 2009. That's it. Every other year of his career, 15 times he didn't get a first-round buy, and I think that's because he left a lot of wins on the table. Despite how much he won, I still think he left a lot of wins on the table with his turnovers. This was just a separate thing. I looked at field goal kicking, how well his team kicked field goals compared to the opponents, and overall, it didn't seem to be any sort of consistency. It varied wildly from year to year. I don't really know how much there was in any correlation in terms of winning, because there's some years, really, I mean, you look at his absolute peak years where the Packers were dominant and they were absolutely destroyed in terms of field goal percentage by their opponents, and then you have other years where the team wasn't anything special and they won the field goal battle. But along the way, overall, Favre was a negative 3% in terms. So that means that his opponents, on average, made 3% more of their field goals than Favre's did. So he was at a little bit of a disadvantage there. But I think over the course of 330 whatever plus games that he played, I think it's negligible. But I just want to throw it in there. This is finally getting to the clutch time aspect of Favre, and this really says it all. If you really want to get down to the nitty gritty, why didn't Brett Favre win more? It's because he was fucking dog shit in the clutch, basically Phillip Rivers-esque in the clutch. The numbers bear it out. Even in 2005 sticks out like a sore thumb. You can see that 10 interceptions. I know I talked about that during the 2005 segment, but there's so many other years. 1 touchdown, 7 interceptions in 2000. I mean, you look at the passer ratings, 64.4. This is regular season only, by the way. I didn't include the playoffs, but we already know that he has plenty of playoff blunders in the clutch too. But this is the regular season. So people talk about choking. I mean, really, Favre, this is who he was. I don't know. I think it would be different if he was a stellar clutch quarterback all the time in the regular season, and then he had these huge interceptions in the playoff. The more I think about it, he really was just kind of doing what he always did. So I don't know if I could say that. I mean, in a way, choking is when you expect somebody to do well and they fail. Everybody, I think, at a certain point expected Favre to fail in clutch moments because he was so bad at them. So I don't know if it's choking or whatever, but it's certainly not good, and it's certainly the biggest reason why I think that he didn't win more than 1 ring. I look at these game-winning drive stats, and I got these from Scott Kazmar. He's the creator of the game-winning drive. He keeps track of all this stuff, and he combined a bunch of recently retired notable quarterbacks with active quarterbacks, and he tracks all the game-winning, how efficient they are at converting opportunities into wins. And you look at Favre, I took 61 quarterbacks here. Favre was 36 out of 61, which is not great. It's below average, but it gets even worse. You look at Favre was 46 and 75 for 38%. So I decided to sort it by the amount of opportunities, and then that's where you really see Favre's deficiencies pop out. He was ranked 9th out of 10 quarterbacks with at least 100 opportunities. The only one he was better than was Phillip Rivers, who's another guy who played forever and was terrible in clutch time. We all joked about Phillip Rivers. I made a video about it. I mean, Phillip Rivers made Favre look like Joe Montana. He was ranked 20th out of 24th of all quarterbacks with at least 50 opportunities, and he was 26th out of 33 quarterbacks with at least 40. So a lot of the quarterbacks who with worser conversion rates than him in the clutch were really just due to smaller sample size. Usually a quarterback with so many opportunities, usually they do really well. Usually they're really well. That's why they get play long, they get more opportunities because they're great quarterbacks. It's not very often that it's very rare and weird to see a quarterback be great for so much of the time, and then in this certain situation be so terrible. And there's a little, and Rodgers is kind of like this as well. Favre's at 38%, Rodgers is at 39%. So Rodgers, people talk about why didn't Green Bay win more championships during the Favre-Rodgers eras and 30 years there. Well, the defense certainly played a part, but both Favre and Rodgers weren't great in clutch moments. And finally, I end this video with what I think are Brett Favre's top 5 missed opportunities for more championships. Number 5 is 2003. I said that he should have made the NFC Championship game, if not for a couple of plays, including the 4th and 26 conversion, which wasn't his fault, but it was his fault that he had that terrible interception in overtime. He would have gotten to play a very good but beatable Carolina team on the road in the NFC Championship game had he won. I don't think he and that Packers team would have been able to beat both Carolina and New England, but we'll never know now. But this was the closest that he ever got to a Super Bowl without actually making it to the NFC Championship game. Number 4, 1995. He had the lead in the 4th quarter of the NFC Championship game. His defense gave it up, and then he threw a terrible, bad interception, just like he did in 07 and 09. But Dallas was the better team, and Green Bay's defense couldn't stop the triplets, Aikman, Smith, and Irvin. But it is interesting, though, if Green Bay had had found a way to pull off that upset like they did against the 49ers the week before, they would have gotten to face the Steelers in the Super Bowl, and I think they could have beaten the Steelers because they already did in the regular season that year. I think they could have beaten the Steelers had they made it to the Super Bowl, but they just couldn't get past Dallas. Number 3, 2007, 3 chances at home to send your team to the Super Bowl in the fourth quarter and overtime. Couldn't get it done. I have it ranked 3rd instead of 2nd because even if Green Bay had won to go on to Super Bowl 42, don't think they would have beaten the Patriots. I wouldn't have trusted Favre to be as clutch in the fourth quarter as Eli Manning was. And plus, let's be honest, I mean, would there be a helmet catch involved? I don't know. Maybe this is just part of me. I don't want history to change because the Patriots lost and Tom Brady was prevented from a perfect season. But I mean, it took a lot of things to go the Giants' way at the end there. I don't think that Favre would have been as clutch as Eli, so I don't think they would have beaten the Patriots. Number 2, 2009, Favre literally had the team in field goal range in the AFC Championship game to go to the Super Bowl, but then he obviously had that terrible crossbody interception to Tracy Porter, who had a hell of a playoffs that year, by the way. Had the Vikings won and advanced to Super Bowl 44, I think they could have beaten the Colts. The Colts were a top-heavy team. Basically, Peyton Manning was the sheriff there, and they had some other like Reggie Wayne and Dallas Clark, but there was nobody else on the Colts that really scared you besides Peyton Manning. I think the Vikings were a better team than Indy, and they could have won that Super Bowl. And finally, number 1, the biggest missed opportunity Brett Favre's career, 1997, Super Bowl 32. Pretty self-explanatory. He was at his absolute peak. He had 2 drives with the score tied in the fourth quarter of the Super Bowl to win and repeat as Super Bowl champions, and he couldn't get it done. And really, in a way, his career was never the same after that loss. Never got back to another Super Bowl, never won another MVP, but hey, that's life. So where does Favre rank all time among quarterbacks? I would say he's in the lower part of the top 10, probably 10th or 10th to 12th in that range. Great peak, just too inconsistent, too many bad moments. But this was a guy who in the late 90s, it looked as though he was on pace to be one of the top 2 or 3 quarterbacks of all time. So in a sense, him finishing and being a consensus lower top 10 quarterback now by the time his career is over, could be viewed as somewhat of a disappointment. Thanks for watching. This was a lot to go through, a lot to research, and a lot to edit and put together, but I thank you all for taking the time to watch it. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed making it. Take care, and please subscribe if you haven't already.